It took me a long time to make my selections, but I'm finally ready to share with you my top 10 favorite books of all time. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Today I will share with you my top 10 favorite books of all time in no particular order. The first book on the list is Bleak House by Charles Dickens. It was published in 1853 and has a complicated plot which deals with conflicting wills. When I read this book, I took my time with it, and I think that made a difference. There are many subplots within the book. Of course, it's a Dickens novel, so the characters are described in vivid details, and it's an epic story. But it's different from other Dickens novels because much of the story is told from the perspective of Esther, who is the main character. You would think it would be hard for a man to put himself in a woman's shoes, but as it turns out, Dickens does an amazing job. Esther is a very loving and generous person to the point of risking her own life to help others. It makes you reflect on the meaning of kindness. It's a sure sign of a good book when you still think about it years later and ponder the questions that were raised in the book. There's a beautiful friendship between Esther and Caddy, who is a few years younger than Esther, and it makes you realize the power of friendship. For Caddy to know that someone truly cares about her seems to give her more agency in her life, and I really enjoyed that whole storyline. Okay, the second book on the list is The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This book was published in 1891. Some people classify this book as a gothic horror. It's the story of a young man, Dorian Gray, who is having his portrait painted. When the portrait is finished, he makes a wish. He wishes he could stay young and that the portrait could age in his place. By some magical turn of events, he gets his wish. So the story explores how preserving his youthful appearance will change Dorian's life. I initially read this book as an assignment for a class in college, and then I reread the book years later at a time when I had been reading a lot of nonfiction books, and I was trying to get back into reading fiction again. Interestingly, when I read it the second time, I felt like I had a whole new understanding of Dorian Gray. It led me to reflect on the symbolism of the magic portrait metaphor, and I would say I enjoyed the book even more the second time I read it. This book stands out as a unique reading experience, unlike any other book I've read. It feels like it touches on some fundamental principles of the human condition. I highly recommend it. The next book on the list is another book by Charles Dickens. Oliver Twist, published between 1837 and 1839. It's the story of Oliver, who is an orphan and somehow ends up being recruited to work with a group of children whose main activity is pickpocketing, and who all report to Fagin, who acts as their boss/caregiver. It may have been inspired by Charles Dickens' own experience because apparently he himself worked in a workhouse when he was 12 years old. And he wanted to portray how children who didn't have any family were used as child labor or taken advantage of. Even though the story is a social commentary about a specific time and place, I think it had a strong impact on me because there's something universal about it. To me, it's a story about trauma and healing from trauma. One of the powerful messages in this book is that regardless of how abusive your caregivers are as a child, you form a bond with them. And even when you realize it was an abusive environment later on, it's almost like you have to teach yourself how to stay away. I'm interested in the topic of trauma, and I would recommend this book to anyone who is on a healing journey. Okay, the next book on the list is Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. This book was published in 1874 and was actually a huge success among readers back then, and it marked a turning point in Thomas Hardy's career. Until then, he had been pursuing a career as an architect and was writing on the side. But when this book was so successful, he decided to become a full-time writer. So the book follows Bathsheba Everdeen, who owns a farm and has several men interested in her. She is one of those unforgettable, strong female characters in books. I have read several of Thomas Hardy's books, but so far, this is my favorite. Thomas Hardy loves to give long descriptions of the landscape so that the reader becomes immersed in the atmosphere of the place. His novels are set in Southwest England, so there's a closeness to nature, which I really like. Allow me to read you this short passage where he compares the feeling of standing on a hill with trees on both sides to the feeling of being in a church. The instinctive act of humankind was to stand and listen and learn how the trees on the right and the trees on the left wailed or chanted to each other in the regular antiphonies of a cathedral choir, how hedges and other shapes to leeward then caught the note, lowering it to the tenderest sob, and how the hurrying gust then plunged into the south to be heard no more. Okay, the next book on our list is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. This book was published in 1960, but it actually takes place in the 1930s in a small town in Alabama. The story is told from the perspective of a little white girl. The important themes in the book are racism, empathy, and the way children see through the contradictions that adults pretend not to see. This book really made me think. It made me reflect on the meaning of courage and the issue of whether or not it's healthy to assume that everyone is fundamentally good. It made me reflect on how strong peer pressure can be, even for adults. It showed me the importance of encouraging critical thinking in children. To me, a book that makes you think is the definition of a classic. Okay, the next book on our list is I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. It was published in 1969, and it's actually the first of a 7-volume autobiographical series. Maya Angelou and her brother were sent to live with their grandmother in Arkansas when they were really young. This book also tackles the issue of racism, but seen from the point of view of the Black community. This is an important book because you get to see all the layers of psychological damage that systemic racism inflicts on a Black child. Later on, Maya and her brother move back to California. There is definitely trauma in this book, but somehow there are certain encounters in her life that have a healing effect so that you feel like all is not lost. Maya Angelou is able to find the words to pinpoint exactly what her feelings are at any given moment. This is the kind of book that will leave you shaken and pondering. I actually have an entire video dedicated to this book too. If you're interested, it is one of the videos from my book discussion playlist. Okay, the next book on our list is Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. This book takes place in Ireland in the 1980s. It's a short book, but it's written so beautifully and the emotions are so strong that it stays with you. I won't give away the plot since it's so short, but suffice it to say, I'm considering making it a tradition to read this every December as the story takes place around Christmas. The tone of this book is very understated, so you feel like there's a lot going on below the surface. I'm actually planning to read Claire Keegan's short story collection titled So Late in the Day, so stay tuned on that one. The next book on our list is Annie John by Jamaica Kincaid. This book was published in 1985. It's the story of Annie's childhood. So Annie is growing up in Antigua, and as she becomes a teenager, her mother starts to treat her differently, and it makes the transition into adolescence a painful one for Annie. What makes this book unique is that the imagery is so vivid that it borders on magical realism. Jamaica Kincaid has a writing style that is bold and brutally honest, but at the same time rich in metaphors. You may want to read this book if you're interested in mother-daughter relationships, but then again, you may want to read this book if you're just looking for beautiful writing. Okay, the next book on our list is The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. This is a 2013 novel that follows Theo. Theo is a teenage boy who loses his mother, and so the book is an exploration of trauma, mental health, also deals with substance abuse. To me, it's a portrayal of how messy someone's life can become who is living with PTSD and just trying to numb the pain. What I liked about this book was the rich inner life of the main character. Even though a lot of external events take place, ultimately it's what's going on in his mind that truly matters. Donna Tartt is skilled at the art of creating a whole universe with many memorable characters that you will remember fondly as if you had met them yourself. Okay, so the last book on today's list is East of Eden by John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck is one of my favorite American writers. This book feels like an epic novel. So there are various families whose backstories you learn about, and there are separate storylines that then start intersecting with each other so that the main story comes together and it feels like fate with a capital F. There are themes of nature versus nurture, sibling rivalry, love, despair, obsession, the longing for parental approval, friendship. It's a monumental story that is well written, well structured, and well paced. So far, it's my favorite Steinbeck novel, but I am planning to read The Grapes of Wrath, so stay tuned on that one. So I just want to point out that this is my top 10 list as of 2024, but I may have to do an updated list once I've read more books. I hope you enjoyed this video. Till next time, happy reading!